we should also say one more thing where, dare I carefully say this, but it seems like riots and civil wars is a feature, not a bug of the system.
Yes.
This is a different thing that we have to the modern day, is because the threat of a civil war, a violent civil war where you overthrow the government and there's just a lot of death and struggle for power is always a threat. That's another incentive, I guess the stick, not the carrot, but the stick for the emperor to behave.
Yes, it's the main one. In other words, just take the 1,000 years that I study. There's something like 120 civil wars.
Mm-hmm.
Now, these are usually very swift. They're over quickly, and they're never about ideology. So they're not like modern civil wars, right? It's about slavery or the rights of kings or whatever. No. They're solely about who has the power. All sides have the same ideology. They talk about, the responsibility of government in the same way, right? They're just competing over who's the best man to do the job, right? And so once you have that situation, and it might not be a civil war, it could be a palace coup, it could be a kind of fighting in the capital, something like that. Once everyone's taken their side and you have a winner, that's the emperor, and you often overthrow the previous regime. I'll give you some statistics. Something like 46% of the emperors of Constantinople are overthrown through violence. 46%. That's almost half, right? So that's a huge number, which means that every emperor is vulnerable and insecure, and they know it, right? So what they have to do is make sure that that doesn't happen to them. And the way to do that is not by arresting and executing everybody you think might be a threat, or just generally behaving like a Caligula or Nero. That will just get you killed. Like, they know this. So the best way to avoid that fate is to actually do the things that will make people happy so that they don't support a rebel if a rebel decides to appear. And sometimes rebels would appear. There's a kind of convention in Constantinople. Like, sometimes you think, that emperor is pretty unpopular and I think I can overthrow him. And what you would do is you would march down the center boulevard and you'd have your people just call the populace of Constantinople out to rally, to, maybe go to Hagia Sophia, the church, and just create a big crowd and call for the deposition of the emperor. And, maybe that would happen. And sometimes it did, and sometimes it didn't. And the rebel or wannabe rebel would sort of proceed down the boulevard, and people would just gradually just disappear, and then he'd be left alone and go up to Hagia Sophia as seeking asylum, right? So that's a bid. That's someone making a bid for the throne, and it just goes disastrously bad. Other times, the people come out because they hate the emperor, and they drag the emperor out and cut his nose off or whatever. So emperors are constantly trying to prevent that from happening, and the best way to do that is for goodwill.
I'm trying to load in that kind of world because it's a different world than we live in today.
Yes.
There's a constant inner workings of policy development inside government.
Yes.
But the check on power is like literal, like, we will murder you.
Yes, it depends on the period. Sometimes murder you, sometimes blind you, sometimes cut your nose off. But there were periods...
Thank you for the nuance.
No, there were periods that were more civilized. We'll just basically, you get retired to a monastery.
Right.
Okay. You're right. So here's what elections do. Elections give a government a mandate for, 4 or 5 years. And during that period, you may be unpopular, but you're legitimate, right? Because of the institutions. Whereas in Constantinople, we don't have those kinds of institutions. We have instead an ongoing referendum. We just call it a perpetual referendum, right? And in fact, the emperors they're conducting opinion polls in a sense because they appear in public. They appear in public, everyone is expected to cheer and chant acclamations, right? Like slogans, right? So you have 100,000 people in the Hippodrome all chanting, worthy or many years for you, Augustus, or something like this. And if that happens, it's great. But if you appear in the Hippodrome and people are like sullen, if the chanting is a bit tepid, or if they're booing, then you know something's wrong, right? So you got to find out what's wrong. It could be something like the the grain supply is not working or whatever. And so emperors are desperate to fix those problems.
And the Hippodrome is this big gathering place in Constantinople, which I guess a lot of people gathered at and did this kind of cheering or not cheering based on policy and whether the emperor is popular or not. This was democracy. I apologize to use that term, but in our conception of what that means, because what do we mean by democracy in the modern day is that the people somehow have a connection to who leads and how they lead. And the Hippodrome was that connection between the people and the leaders.
Yes. Now we can talk about modern democracy if you want. I have my own views about modern democracy. And how it works and how it doesn't, and anyway, whether it is democracy in fact, because there are other models of democracy like ancient Athenian democracy, which is a whole other thing. But you're right. So it's not just in the Hippodrome. It's wherever people assemble in large numbers. So this could be military mustering grounds, right? So the army is also the Roman people in a way, and in some cases the most decisive part of it, right? So if an army gathers together and they decide they want a different emperor, that's serious. And that can happen out in the provinces too. That doesn't necessarily have to happen in Constantinople. There's also Hagia Sophia. So the people gather in the church or they gather in public spaces like the Forum of Constantine. So this can happen anywhere where a large number of people can gather. And I don't know if you want to call it a democracy as such, but it is definitely a form of popular, let's say, consultation and a testing of consensus. I'll give you another example. So in the 1190s, the emperor, Alexius III, he's being threatened by the German emperor. German emperor is basically, you pay me a bunch of money or I'll invade. Just straight up extortion.
Yeah.
And Alexius decides, okay, I'm gonna gather this money. I'm gonna impose these taxes. And he gathers the people in the Hippodrome, and he says, we're gonna have the German tax. He called it the German tax. And there's such an uproar in the Hippodrome against this that he was like, that wasn't my idea. I don't know where that came from. No, never mind. We're not gonna have the German tax. Unfortunately, the German emperor died, and nothing ever happened. But it gives you a sense of how emperors literally can backtrack when they see that the people are against something in a matter of policy, right? Like tax policy. So yeah, there was this give and take. So institutionally, the emperor might look absolute, as you called him earlier. In practice, no. The ones that did that didn't end well.
And we should say, going to Perplexity here, the Hippodrome of Constantinople was the main stadium and social center of the Byzantine capital, used primarily for chariot racing and imperial ceremony, and today survives in Istanbul's Sultanahmet district. And the reason I looked this up, I wanted to see how many people. Shaped as a long U-shaped race course with a central barrier and tiered seating, it may have held from roughly 30,000 up to 100,000 spectators, though exact capacity is debated because archaeological remains are limited.
Yes.
That's a lot of people.
30,000 is definitely a pretty underestimate.
Yeah.
The Hippodrome is still there. I mean, you can see it from satellite photos. The shape of it is still there. And actually some parts of the Sfendoni, the sling around the southern side is still there. You can walk around it. And it's right next to the palace. In other words, emperors didn't have to go far. Now, sometimes there are events for replacing an emperor. So say the emperor dies in his sleep and there's no heir. This happens in 491, for example. And so the people gather in the Hippodrome in order to have a discussion with the court about whom to appoint. Now, in those kinds of contexts, it's entirely possible that there are people also in the arena, like not just in the stands. I think some military units might have just been arrayed there rather than in the stands. So you can get more people than what we project might fit in the stands because they're not having the races on that day.
We should say, so I think the thing that was emphasized in the first paragraph is the athletic events and the entertainment events, right? Like the imperial ceremony. But there is a sort of a political gathering was also popular. The Hippodrome was not just for sport. It was where emperors appeared before the people, where acclamations, public punishments, and political demonstrations took place, and where the rival circus factions, blues, greens, reds, whites, became powerful social and sometimes paramilitary forces. And this goes on and on and on. So this was a place
it's a
for
very
the
important
people
place. Yeah.
to speak to the leader.
Yeah. Vent sometimes.
Yeah.
Even insult them.
Yeah, this is fascinating. I mean, it's human civilization has converged towards a mechanism that has clearly worked, because for the empire in the East stood for 1,000 years. So it's fascinating. We as humans, throughout our history, we would try to figure out, okay, how do we figure out how to govern large collections of humans in a way that they're represented, in the way that they don't riot, they don't rebel,
Yes.
in the way that we flourish together as a people, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So this is the East Roman Empire is a real study of something that seemed to have worked. There's lessons there even for the modern times, I think. And modern times, again, is very early human civilization.
From a certain standpoint, yes, we are still early in
trying to figure it out. Yeah.
Yes. Now, mind you, I'm not advocating for this type of social organization and government. What I'm trying to do as a historian is understand how and why it survived, and also to find the ways that it worked, because it did work. We know that much. We have to start from that. It survived. It was resilient. There was a lot of give and take in the exercise of power. And I want to understand the mechanisms of that.